Welcome to Shakti Punch. I am your host Pranav. In this show we go together hand in hand on a cosmic voyage to unravel the true nature of reality, divinity, liberation, through a distinctly Dharmic and Indic lens. We're talking philosophy, we're talking mythology, we're talking spirituality, and we're also talking about the tools of the trade. That's one thing we don't really emphasize enough that I do want to bring up, is that we are going to be talking about very distinct tools that Dharma does offer. Yoga, meditation, breath work, all of that stuff, which are so important in being able to realize the nature of the true self. Let's get into it, guys. First of all, we're only 426,875 years, 181 days, 3 hours, 13 minutes, and 40 seconds left in the Kali Yuga. Time's flying by fast, you know? Oh my gosh, oh my God, I got stuff to do. Listen, we got some time here. Got some time for some karmas to burn together. It's honestly, we're gonna get into this later today, but it's actually a pretty brief amount of time. You know what I mean? So, you know, live every day like it's your last, even though we've got over 400,000 years left of this, and God knows how many lifetimes we're all gonna have to go through before we get this ism called life correct. How are you feeling with the Kali Yuga? Are you are you feeling any kind of way, or is it taking too long? Are you having an "are we there yet" kind of feeling?
Kali Yuga has been a little tough on me this week, but I'm still digging it. You know,
this week in Kali Yuga.
Yeah, this week in Kali Yuga. That's for the Patreon. That's going to be a little side thing that we do.
What I love, and we are going to talk about this later today, because we're going to be talking more about the Yoga Vishishta and the story of Lila, but there is a distinct sense of relativity, the theory of relativity, which is baked into the yoga theory as well, because they really refer to it as a day of Brahma, you know what I mean? Which is like, this is like an hour of Brahma, actually, the Kali Yuga, where I think the other ones where you had said, I think there was a scale of 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. Hindus, they're very maximalist. We are a very maximalist people, you know what I mean?
Especially with time.
Especially with time. It's not like, oh, he was praying for days or years. They're like, no, it was 10,000 years he was meditating. It's like, Jesus Christ, what the fuck are we doing?
We can't help it. We have the most amount of rivers, the highest mountains.
That's true.
Largest population.
That's true. It's like one big ashram, actually.
Most amount of spices.
It's true. It's true. I'm convinced that the spices are like the first form of like hallucinogens. I think if you only been eating maybe salt, you know what I mean? And then you're getting some garam masala, you're probably just like, it's probably like ayahuasca for you or something, you know?
Hence the birth of colonialism.
Hence the birth of colonialism.
The psychedelic spice trade. We're not referring to Dune.
That's literally is referring to Dune, though, actually. It's so fascinating to me because a friend of mine was talking to me about like Buddhism coming, the kind of introduction of it into the West, right? And it happened really through the British Empire. And it's really interesting how the Brits, they came in and they colonized and it was intense resource extraction and extreme degradation for Indians and so on. But they couldn't help but look at the philosophy and be like, actually, this is kind of fucking cool, you know? He was telling me about all these people, but what really fascinated me was that really occurred at this sort of material peak of the British Empire, right? The introduction, the fascination with Buddhism, Vedanta, things like that. We're talking like the 30s, 40s kind of things, right? I'm sure there's a lot of stuff before that was happening. And it kind of makes me wonder, and maybe you can tell me more about this, about the actual introduction of, say, Buddhism or shamanistic traditions within India itself, right? This is all happening during the Mauryas, right? The first true political consolidation of the Indian subcontinent as we know it. And then what happens, you're at a place of absolute material, you've kind of reached an end of history moment, materially speaking, and what happens, a whole new ideology comes in, right? There's a spiritual yearning. There's a need to refresh, to rebrand, to reboot things a little bit. And then you see Buddhism kind of come into play. Of course, it didn't happen completely coeval with Chandragupta Maurya. I think it was 200-300 years after his death that Ashoka then started to really spread Buddhism around India, right?
I want to say it was Ashoka. There was a lot of flirting with Jainism.
Definitely.
Vedic practices, and then Buddhism later on. And I think it's because being extremely ritualistic or being extremely, maybe sattvic is the word for Jainist kind of approaches, and then Buddhist, they're all kind of useful in their own rights at different points.
Definitely.
In a journey. So if you're a king,
of course.
You know, he's like, today's going to be a Jain day.
Yeah.
You know? Or I really need to justify killing this guy. So
It's going to be a real Vedic day. Need to invoke Indra for this one.
yeah, exactly.
Jains are intense, dude. They're like Sattvic athletes. You know what I mean? They're like extreme Sattvic athletes where they're just like, I will walk with my dick hanging out. We cannot, and I will only eat something that's fallen to the ground. I mean, it's very intense stuff.
They can't step on insects, so they don't use shoes or something?
No, they don't. It's like they don't want to step on insects, even just the cultivation of fabrics and things like that. Yeah. It's really intense. Really beautiful people. It's a very beautiful and philosophically extremely sophisticated tradition. However, the food, you guys don't like garlic or onions. It's like you might as well be British at this point.
Well, this is not me saying this. I've definitely heard this in other places, but the Marwadi Jains got on really well with the British despite the food differences because of business. So
it's true.
Something about being Jain made them really good with numbers.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. Yeah, I mean, Jains take a lot of shit, actually, like Baniya Jains and stuff.
100%.
They get a lot of shit, basically for being,
They got that paisa on lock.
They really do.
Shout out to the Jains.
Shout out to the Jains. Only thing we killing is this game of commerce.
Yeah.
You heard? No shitting on Jains. We love Jains. They are us and we are them. They're beautiful people. So one thing I did want to talk about today, a listener and a friend of the podcast. He's a psychoanalyst, not the psychoanalyst I mentioned on episode 1, not Dr. Shervin Ravan. Is another psychoanalyst. I have a lot of psychoanalyst friends. And we were talking about the podcast. And he was telling me how much he loves the podcast. It's just one thing that is a bit of a sticking point for me. Is he was like, I feel like you were taking some shots towards Abrahamic religions, which were maybe not fair, because these are religions that also have mystical traditions baked into them, or that have developed within them that are very similar to things that you find in Vedanta. And I was like, oh, really? It's like, shut the fuck up, man. No, I didn't say that. Get the fuck out of here. I didn't say that, but it was telling to me because, look, this is not a podcast. It does make me want to make clear, this is not a podcast that is about dunking on the big 3 Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, right? It's not what this is about at all. However, what this podcast is about is dharmic identity formation in the diaspora. This is a podcast that is for people like me, like Adi, kids who grew up in America, people who grew up in America, UK, wherever, who, I don't know how it was for you, Adi. You're younger than me, but for me, there was a sense of alienation around my religion, right? I had a Hanuman poster up in my locker because I was like, this guy's the shit. He burnt all of Lanka with his tail. Amazing. You know what I mean? He was witty. He was great, And then, a Christian friends of mine would see it and they'd be like, what is that? That's a monkey god. And, then they're doing stuff like they're taking me to like Christian punk shows to try and convert me to Christianity. Meanwhile, I think I'm just going to a punk show. I'm like going to smoke cigarettes and be a little badass, No, it's like a Christian punk show. And they're like, listen, now that that's done, I wanted to talk to you about your soul. And I'm just like, what? Remember one time I was like a little kid and a literal janitor was like, you're Indian. I was like, yeah. He's like, you guys believe in reincarnation? I was like, yeah. He's like, well, that's not true. He's like, what, you're going to turn into a coconut? And I was like, what do I know, But I was really getting it from all sides there. And an effect of this that I found is that a lot of people were raised Hindu, and I'm not saying Hinduism is a perfect culture either, right? We've got a lot of things to own up to, for sure. But for me, it's really about, I felt like I and a lot of people like me felt a need to, there's a point where you start to conceal what your identity is a little bit, right? You're like, yeah, this is a bit maximalist. You know what I mean? That's the whole thing about Hinduism. It is a very maximalist religion. Our aesthetics, we come from a land that is very lush. It's countless rivers, mountains, jungles, forests, flora and fauna, just proliferating. It truly is like some, pardon the expression, some Garden of Eden shit. You know what I mean? It's and it's a maximalist place, and thus the imagery that we produce out of this tradition is extremely maximalist. It's variegated. So many colors. Our deities are incorporative of everything around us, the flora and the fauna. This is life. This is an expression of life. And it is a little bit to other traditions going to look like a bit chaotic and a bit like, oh, this is too chaotic for me. I don't feel safe. My nipples are getting a little hard looking at this. Oh no, what do I do? So there's an aesthetic repugnance that they feel towards us. They feel a genuine disgust towards Hindus, right? Because it is a aesthetically maximalist faith. And look, I don't even blame them a lot of times, right? If you're taught as a little Christian kid that the devil is something that has a tail and has horns, it's like, you better not be looking at some of our deities, you know what I mean?
And then they show up in an Indian kid's house for a birthday party and they see a swastika and a drishti mask on the wall. They're like, these are the devil's people.
It's like they're literally worshiping that. Do you remember Wahegu from
Wahegu?
A literal freaking demon? Wahegu! Like that is their energy, you know? And it's like
Shout out episode 1.
Shout out to episode 1. Call back to episode 1. But it's like I don't fully blame them. It's just ignorance, you know what I mean? And so if they're taught like this is what the devil looks like, it was like, first of all, why do you have no image for your God, but you do have some weird images for your devils? You know what I mean? But of course, all of their imagery for devilry is based on pagan traditions, right? That was just an easy way of transposing that over and be like, well, this is the evil thing now, you know? Getting back to my point, though, I don't want to be dunking on other religions. And what I do want to say is that me being a Hindu does not make me any more eligible for moksha than it would for you as a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. It does not. All this stuff is very karmically determined, right? And when I had called these 3 religions the religions of the Kali Yuga, I wasn't even saying that they're not true, that there isn't validity to them. I was just saying that the attributes, right, from the root to the fruit of their behavior is very much in line with certain attributes of the Kali Yuga. That's really all I'm saying. And I'm not saying that Hindus or Hindu Dharma, how it's developed in the modern era, doesn't have some of that as well, right? A lot of what we're doing now and what we're seeing is really the confrontation that a very diverse, decentralized spiritual tradition having to confront people who really have their shit together as political entities. You know what I mean? But you know, my friend Colin, that's what his name was. He brought up a point where this isn't about dunking either, right? However, it is about demarcation. And one thing that we have to say is that, listen, from the root to the fruit, these are religions which are extremely exclusive. They're exclusivist religions, right? They're like, if you don't believe in this, you're going to hell.
Whereas with Hinduism, and this is why a lot of people always make the case that this is not a religion, but a way of life, right?
Yes.
Because just like you said, a Catholic person in Italy could be living could be following the laws of Dharma.
100%.
And following, being
100%. A Muslim guy.
Karmic guy. It doesn't matter who you are.
Totally. 100%.
We just worded it out. That's what
we
Dharma
were
is.
very explicit about because again, this is about the rules of reality. Hinduism is really, we don't care who you worship. That's not what it's about. We're constantly producing. Remember, the conception of divinity is that the super consciousness, through basically a belch in the super consciousness, divinities arise, right? These deities arise. And we as humans cannot just access Brahman easily. The impersonal form is very difficult, as Lord Krishna himself says in the Bhagavad Gita. But the difference is that these religions are saying this is the only way, and that without this, you are going to burn. You're going to burn in some place called hell, and it's going to be painful for you. From the very most rudimentary Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, we're kind of saying the opposite. Now, Lord Krishna does say the path to this moksha is through me, through just pure bhakti to me. But he lays out multiple pathways to achieve liberation, multiple pathways, right? Through knowledge, through renunciation, and then through bhakti. And there's other ones that he mentions as well, I think. And so there are many paths, and one very important distinction, which I think, and again, this is the most rudimentary of Hindu texts, the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, this is Hinduism 101. The first thing that you learn in that is he says, listen, no matter who you are worshiping, no matter who you worship, it doesn't matter, all those prayers are still coming to me. Right? And that's a very important distinction from somebody who says, and if you don't worship me, those prayers don't mean shit. You're worshiping demons. You're going to hell. Right? It's a very important distinction. And so I want to talk about this whole idea of having like ecumenical dialogue with Islam, with Christianity, with Judaism. And you see this through the kind of Hindu Renaissance through people like Paramahansa Yogananda, right? Yogananda always talked about Christ. He loved Christ. Christ this, Christ that, achieving Christhood, meditating on Christ, right? Shirdi Sai Baba, again, very much might have very well been a Muslim. He was very ambiguous. He didn't want anybody to focus on whether or not he had this identitarian label of a Muslim or a Hindu, right? He operated out of a mosque, and he kept a dunni in that mosque. So there is ecumenical outreach that is happening.
Even in our histories, right? some Mughal courts, I think, and even maybe probably Hindu royalists and stuff in different parts of India. Like we've always had discussion between Muslims and Hindus in India in courts.
In courts, right?
Having these spiritual debates and stuff. I mean,
Sure.
there's just a huge tradition.
But here's my point, though, Adi. On a large scale, on a broad scale, from a purely scriptural perspective, right? Those ecumenical dialogues tend to only go in one direction. Right? They only go, Hindus are the ones who are opening themselves up to these things. You don't see pastors in America, or imams elsewhere in the world, or even really in India, who are like, hey, actually, we should think about this concept of Brahman. We should think about this thing about a depersonalization of the divine and a personalization of the divine and all these concepts. We should think about things like karma. We should think about, wow, the Indians maybe really were onto something, because these are concepts that were laid out years before, many, many thousands of years, arguably, before Christianity and Islam, especially, right? Buddhism alone, which is like the last major kind of offshoot of Indian religiosity, right? Indic religion.
Well, Sikhism.
Sikhism, pardon me, yes, Sikhism. But Sikhism is a very unusual case, right? And it comes at a very specific historical moment. We're going to talk about that much later on in the podcast. These are things that happen, and we already laid out a lot of kind of groundwork and foundational ideas about how the cosmos works. And so for me, a lot of the mysticism that comes out of these religions, they're really having to stretch things a bit thin. They're having to do a little bit of intellectual yoga, asanas, in order to incorporate more mystical concepts, as opposed to things that are actually just very rigid, No one is more worshipful, or nobody is more obsessed with the divine or the spiritual than Indians. I mean, really.
Regardless of religion.
And it's so any religion that's going to come here is actually going to, or not here, is going to come there, is going to flourish in a sense, right? Because it's a place
1000%.
that is so obsessed with it. So I did want to point out that this whole desire for being ecumenical in this show especially, and this is my reason why it's not exactly that, right? This is about Dharmic diasporic identity formation. I want people who were Hindus or Buddhists or Jains or whatever it was, whatever tradition that you came, whatever Indic tradition that you came out of, to feel okay about it, to feel proud of it, to not feel alienated by it, and to see what it's about, because there's some really staggering, amazing things that come out of this. And for me, I was realizing, I was talking to two psychoanalysts. We were sitting there hanging out, and we were talking about it. And it's with them who I'm able to sit there and talk about concepts of samsara, right? Repetitive histories of samsara, right? Karma, liberation, ways of viewing oneness with the world, the separation from that oneness, the trajectory of oneness to duality to oneness again, things like this, all these various conversations that I'm having about texts like the Yoga Vashishta or even the Bhagavad Gita. I'm able to have it. To me, that's the real ecumenical conversations to have, isn't with necessarily Western religions. It is, however, with Western psychoanalysis, right? There is where a lot of very fruitful and productive conversations are able to happen, because we really are providing the groundwork for how to recognize the science of the soul. And psychology, we cannot forget, means literally the science of the soul. Psyche in Latin is soul. Right. Yes. Yeah. That is what it means. So I feel like that's where the dialogue is really to be happening. And they have a lot to offer to this conversation as well, because they're really dealing with modernity as well, right? They're dealing with the development of capitalism and what it means to live in capitalist societies and things like that, industrialized societies, evolution of politics as we know it, right? And so they have a lot of valuable things to contribute to this conversation. And that's more of the ecumenical dialogue that I'm actually seeking right now. So I think there's a lot of East-West dialogue that should happen. We should even have this distinction anymore, because what we've also seen is there has been a sort of knowledge transfer, right? Two syringes have been going in different directions. So what you see in the West is there is a desire for some kind of spirituality, right? There is that, and a lot of people are coming to Dharma in their own ways, right? Even like Christians have to be like, wow, they have yoga and meditation. Like maybe we should adapt some of this. But to maintain a very strict, rigid, exclusivist view of the liberation of the soul, while then taking concepts from sort of pagan religions, it's not a great look. It's just, to me, I'm just like, it's intellectually very flimsy. And it's just not very exciting to me. However, with psychoanalysis, with actually new age spirituality in the West gets a bad rap, and I understand why, because it's been so heavily commercialized and it becomes very floofy and fluffy, and they don't, they get a lot of shit, crystals and all that stuff. But these are people as well who are taking a very evolved approach to spirituality, which draws on everything. Right. They're taking stuff not just from Christianity, not just from Sufism, not just from Hinduism, not just from Buddhism, but from ancient South American traditions, a whole shamanic tradition that exists in South and Central America, which are very important. I think there's a ton to be learned from there as well. And I love the dialogue. I want to have that dialogue. And I always have a great time talking to New Age people and to psychoanalysts, because these are people, we're all speaking the same language in a sense, right? Which is just kind of trying to understand the science of the soul, and the science of how we're moving through reality, not just this world on a material level, but how we are imprinted by things that are happening to us, how we were repeating cycles. You know what I mean? How we're repeating traumas constantly, we're replicating traumas and things like that. That's all about samsara, That's what that's all about. And we're about liberation. We're all trying to get that liberation. So just a shout out. I love you guys. I love all of you. I love Christians. I love Muslims. All my best Indian friends are Muslim. And this isn't like a white guy being like, my best friends are black. This is literally a fact. All of my best Indian friends are Muslims. You already know I have Mango Bay with my boy Usama Siddiqui. Shouts to my boy Samir Naseem. So many Muslim people that I genuinely fucking love. But the gateway to that love has been opened by the fact that they're very chill people. You know what I mean? And we do have a certain luxury living in America as diaspora Indians, in that we don't necessarily have to have all the baggage, all the communal baggage that exists in India. So I'm speaking in that sense from a very privileged position. If anybody in India is watching, I'm living an extraordinarily privileged life in that I'm able to have healthy relationships with people from different faiths that are not circumscribed by communal boundaries, right? And communal tensions and hostilities. So take it all for what it's worth. Again, I'm not a guru. I'm not an acharya. I am a student. Shishya Nation. That's what this is about. I'm learning. I'm learning from you guys. Hopefully you guys will contribute as well. Because, I'm doing a lot of talking here. All right. My jaw is getting tired a little bit. So today we're getting back into the Yoga Vashishta, and my God, it is too deep. We're getting into the story of Lila now, which if anybody who knows anything about the Yoga Vashishta knows, shit's getting crazy in here. Shit is getting real crazy in here. So where did we really leave off? We really leave off with Vashishta telling Sri Ram that this whole material world that we think is real is, in fact, it's just pure consciousness. That's all it is. The real world, as we think of it, imagine it is to be real, is actually not real. This is all just consciousness. It is kind of a simulation, right? Crazy, wild stuff. And in order to elaborate on this point, he narrates the story of Lila. And the story of Lila is pretty long, so we're only going to get into about half of it today. But the story of Lila more or less goes like this: once upon a time there was a kingdom, and there's a king there. His name was Padma, and his wife was named Lila, Queen Lila. And they were in love. They were both just hotties, and of course the descriptions that they're going into about how the beauty of Lila, it's like an R&B song. It's like her limbs were like the moonlight and to touch her was bliss. It's like very R&B'd out, right? The litany of epithets. It's the thing. We are so maximalist. We can't just chill with the description, and be like, her beauty was like the moon or whatever. And then moving on, it's like, oh no, I have to describe every limb of her body. Her eyes were like lotuses, her limbs were like creeper vines on a this thing tree, and it's translucent. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? Just calm down, guys. Vashishta, just chill, Valmiki. And anyway, there's this couple. They're a royal couple, right? He's the king, she's the queen, and she's becomes obsessed with their love to the point where she's like, God damn, if I die before him, I'm going to attain self-realization and stuff, but he's just going to be here. But then if he dies before me, I can't deal with that. I love him so much. He's such a baddie. He's so hot. He's so wonderful and virtuous, I guess, that I need him here. I need him to be immortal. And so first thing that she does is she talks to the kind of the holy ones of the court. And she's like, how can I do this? And they're like, hey, listen, babe, it's like, we get it. But listen, you can meditate a lot and you can do a lot of different sadhanas and you're going to live the most fulfilling, beautiful life imaginable through self-discipline and sadhana. It's going to be great. And she's like, shut the fuck up. That's not what I'm talking about. All these people in all of these various stories in Vedanta, it's always like, hey, what's up with immortality? Can I attain immortality? It's all about solving the problem of being an embodied person, right? And of course, the big reveal at the end is like, you're already immortal. Sorry, spoiler alert, But they're like, listen, you can do this and that, but that's not really how this works. And she's insistent though. She's totally insistent. So she decides that she's going to do some like really extreme sadhana, so she is praying and meditating and doing a very extreme form of intermittent fasting, of eating once every 3 days. And she does this for about a year until Ma Saraswati, who is traditionally considered the consort of Sri Brahma, the creator deity, and Saraswati, just as, so she's the goddess of creativity, art, letters, study, knowledge in general. And I was always obsessed with Saraswati since I was a kid because I saw once a picture of her and it was like a really beautiful rendition. She was in moonlight and I was like, that is my wife. I love her. And I'm like 7 years old or something, like, she's beautiful. Like,
my sister would always guilt me when I would swear. If I said fuck, she's like, every time you swear, you are stabbing Goddess Saraswati.
No!
And I was like, you can't do that to me. Shout out to my sister, Happy Raki.
Happy Raki, by the way, guys. I don't know if it's probably too late for that.
But yes, goddess of language, goddess of knowledge.
Yes. I mean, she's pictured holding a stack of shastras or whatever in her hand and a sitar, and so she's music. Yeah. And music is what it's about, creativity.
Sorry, Veena, not sitar.
Sorry, Veena. Yes, not sitar. Very correct. Very, very, very correct. Thank you, Adi. So anyway, Goddess Saraswati shows up and she's like, "Hey, what's happening?" She's like, "Hey, I really want my husband to live forever, And she's like, all right, And the day comes and her husband dies in battle. And she's bereft and she's like, hey, what do I do? And Saraswati comes and she's like, okay, well, just cover his corpse in a bunch of flowers. There you go. And all that does is preserve the body, though, right? She's like, well, what the fuck, It's like, I feel like I've been cheated. You know how long I was intermittent fasting for? I lost my butt because of this, Like, I lost my curves because of this, you know what I mean? She's like, what happens? I feel cheated, And Saraswati is like, okay, listen, you want to see him? Fine. But the first thing that you have to realize is that every jiva, and jiva, by the way, is the individualized character of the soul, right? That is the individual sort of soul that we're dealing with. It is the mind-body-soul complex that is any given individual, right? It says every jiva inhabits 3 types of spaces. And here we're getting into a very important concept in Vedanta and in yoga, which is the 3-body doctrine. Right, is that we all have 3 bodies. Now, in the Yoga Vashishta, he refers to it as spaces, that we inhabit 3 spaces. But to me, this is the same thing. He's talking about the 3-body doctrine. And 3 bodies that we inhabit are our gross body, our subtle body, and our causal body, right? And our gross body is what? Our gross body is our physical form, right? It's my hands, it's my hair, it's my chest, it's everything, it's my sweat, right? The subtle body, on the other hand, are things like our perceptive abilities, right? Our senses, our ability to smell, to hear, to taste things, right? Those are the sensation. Those are things that are then our emotions, things like that. Those are things that are comprising the subtle body. And then the causal body, which is it can be a little bit confusing, but this is the highest of those bodies. And this is the state that kind of approaches pure consciousness that is attached to you. And I think this is the body where your karmas are attaching to you, right? And all of the things like your latent tendencies and stuff are getting stuck to those before you transmigrate to whatever your next phase of this is, right? If you're reincarnating. So these are the 3 bodies and she's describing them. And Ma Saraswati explains to Lila that, listen, you have to inhabit that 3rd space in order to basically astrally project yourself and I'll help you with that. And this is the only way she's going to be able to see her husband. She's the only way she's going to be able to see Padma. She says, I'm going to help you with that. I'm going to help you attain Nirvikalpa, which, as we discussed before, is a state of consciousness that is free from thought, right? It is experiencing the mind beyond the mind, if you will. And so she helps to induce this state into Lila, and she takes her then to a place where she sees her husband, and she looks and she sees the king, and he's hanging out, and he's got all his ministers around him, and he's holding court, but she herself is not seen. Right? She herself is not seen. And she comes back to her so-called gross body, which by all descriptions, not gross at all. She's a baddie. Comes back to her gross body, and she's very confused because she's like, what did I just see there? Right? He should be alive, but he's not there anymore. And so she goes and she wakes up all the ministers and everybody there, and she just to make sure that they're not dead. And then she's very confused. And she's asked Ma Saraswati, she's like, well, which of these places is actually real? And she's like, okay, let me just tell you about something else. Okay. She says, so listen, in the remotest, tiniest corner of the all-encompassing super consciousness, there is a shrine with a blue dome. It is a structure, it has 14 holes. And in those holes, in one of those holes, in the tiniest corner of that hole, there are mounds of dirt and puddles, which are basically the universe and created reality as you know it. That's in the most remote, tiniest corner of super consciousness. And she says, that queen, that's the universe. She says, in an even tinier corner of that plane is a hut, and in that hut is a rishi and his wife. And this rishi, who is also named Vishishta, no relation apparently, and whose wife is also named Arundhati, I guess also apparently no relation. This is what they say in Venkatesananda's translation. There are these this rishi and his wife, and they live in this hut, living a simple sort of pious life together. But one day, this rishi looks out of the window, and he oversees a royal procession of a king. And he says, oh my gosh, that looks kind of bad. That looks pretty sick. I want to live a life like that with a bunch of dudes surrounded by an army and all this pomp and shiny armor and just looking like the man, resplendent, you know? He's like, I want some of that, actually. So he lived the rest of his life, this other Rishi Vishishta, and then he dies. And then after that, he inhabits the life of a king. And Mara Saraswati reveals to Lila that king is your husband Padma, and his wife Arundhati is actually you. All of this is taking place within that little hut of this very humble rishi. That's where all of this is happening. And she says very specifically, she says, and obviously Lila is confused. She's like, what? And she's like, listen, homie, in every atom there exists worlds within worlds. The superimposition, there's nothing linear in this world. Everything is superimposed on top of it. All these quantum states or whatever you want to call it, right? And she says, also, by the way, just another thing, that happened 8 days ago. That Rishi's vision. And she's like, 8 days? She's like, how could that be 8 days? I've lived my entire life. King Padma has lived his entire life. What do you mean that happened 8 days ago? And Saraswati says to her, reveals to her, that like space, time has no fixed span. Okay, time has no fixed span. A moment and an epoch are both as imaginary as each other. Everything is happening basically in a single moment. Our way of experiencing time is not real. Time is not real in the way that we think it is, just the same way that space is not real. And she demonstrated it through the concept of her actually all of this taking place possibly within the hut of this rishi and having happened actually an entire lifetime having happened 8 days ago. Pretty insane stuff, right? I mean, for me, I was just like, okay, this is, when was this written again? You know what I mean? I had to go back and check. Yeah, this is written a pretty long time. This is written, over 1,000 years ago, probably 1,500 years ago or something. And she basically reveals that, again, all thought forms in infinite consciousness, they're like waves in the ocean. That's all it is. There are tiny waves, there are big waves, no matter what, they're all waves. And this world and its creation is actually nothing but a memory, okay, which is one kind of a knowledge that she lays out. And one thing that kind of came to mind when I was thinking about this in terms of like everything being sort of a memory, but actually not being the thing itself, is whenever we think about stars, right? when you know this, right? You hear that, listen, all the stars that we're seeing in the sky, they don't actually exist anymore. What we're seeing is actually just the memory, the impression of those stars.
Or they might exist, but we might be seeing them because it takes light time to travel. We might be seeing them in the past.
And exactly. We were seeing them in the past, right? And for me, I felt like, okay, maybe this is kind of a helpful metaphor, or not. Maybe it's more confusing.
No, it totally makes sense.
Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Guys, does it make sense? So she tells her that she can't really comprehend these things immediately. Saraswati tells Lila, you can't comprehend these things immediately because she only exists in a material form. She's existing as part of this illusion, right? And that in order to, she needs to assume what Saraswati calls a body of light, which to me sounds a little bit like the causal body. But Saraswati says, like, what you're seeing for me, I'm just a body of light. That's all I am. You're not a body of light, actually. You're living on a whole different plane of existence right now. And the reason I'm able to see all these things and you're not able to see these things, and I'm able to do these things at will and travel at will through time and space is because I'm a body of light. You are a body of gross material matter, right? Which is itself just a sort of illusion of the superconsciousness. And so how can she attain this state of being a so-called body of light? And Ma Saraswati says the first step to this is quieting the ego. Quieting the ego is what needs to happen. And quieting the ego has to happen through abhyasa, which, as we know, abhyasa just means persistent practice. Right? So it's through the persistent practice that we quiet the ego, and we can hope to then achieve this state of nirvikalpa and then achieve this further state that is perhaps beyond the causal body to be a body of light, right? And so what is the practice? What is the actual practice? The practice is, according to Ma Saraswati, is to understanding that this world is not real and that this is all just consciousness. The practice is to think about it, to talk about it, to always resort to that in your mind, that none of this is real. And this helps you broaden your vision of what reality is. It broadens your vision away from your own mundane worldly concerns. Oh, I don't have enough money. Oh, I'm going through a breakup. Oh, I'm going through this. I'm going through that. You broaden your vision. Once you're able to focus your attention and resort to always your mind's last resort is that actually none of this is actually real. This is all a sort of dream within a dream within a dream. Understand you're broadening your vision that this state we're in is not real, to acknowledge that the universe itself is not real. And by undergoing this practice, your desires cease. Now, a very important point that is made here by Saraswati and through Vashishta is that your desires cannot be quelled through simple austerity, right? And this is a very interesting thing that they're bringing up. And because I think the Yoga Vashishta is a very intellectual document, it is a scripture, right? And we know from the Bhagavad Gita that one of the many paths through liberation is through that of knowledge, right? Inquiry, intellectualism, essentially, is a valid path towards liberation. So what they say is actually it's not through austerity or by forcing or repressing your desires and things like that. None of that works because they're still lurking there. The only way is through this meditation on the unreality of the world. That's the only way you can achieve that state is through not just simply acknowledging, but embracing and always having that fixed in your mind that the world that as we know it is not real. Pretty crazy shit.
Is that Maya, what we're talking about? Or am I?
Well, we're living in Maya, right?
Yeah.
And I think we're going to get into concepts of determining, well, what is Maya actually? Because, right, and this is, of course, one of the big philosophical conundrums that they resolve in Vedanta, which is that, okay, well, if all of this is actually Brahman and what we're experiencing isn't real, how can something, and Saraswati alludes to this earlier, because when Lila is asking, well, which of these two states is real? Are me seeing the king with all his ministers real, or is the state that I'm in now real? And she says, well, what do you think is real? She says, I think what I'm in right now is real. And she says, well, nothing unreal can be produced by that which is real. The effect of the unreal cannot be, or the effect of the unreal cannot be the real, right? And so that's a very important distinction. I think that's sort of alluding to when we get into this conversation of how do we reconcile Maya with Brahman, right, as a concept. And it's a lot of heady stuff. You know what I mean? And through the rest of this section on Lila and Saraswati, we may get to this in the next chapter, we may not. But they're going on basically a cosmic voyage through the universe where she's showing how all the worlds were formed and all the continents were formed and acknowledging various different continents on planet Earth, you know, and how they were formed and things like that. And it's all happening because she is able to dissolve herself into light. She describes the metaphor as like, I am like the smoke from an incense. I can waft wherever I am, like water, essentially, and permeate through anything, essentially. And that's how she's able to go and experience the state of being this other Rishi Vashishta who's in a hut somewhere, right? And access that, and then access the state of seeing her husband alive, and then come back to this reality of her being in the gross body, et cetera, et cetera.
Beautifully told, Pranav.
Oh, thank you. I'm a little bit hesitant about these things because, as I said before, and I always emphasize, I'm not a guru, I'm not an acharya, I'm a learner. And so as I'm learning about these things, my own wonder and hesitations and even doubts can creep through as I'm trying to explicate it to everyone out there, you know. But I do appreciate that. I hope you guys also found it really helpful. And if people felt like there were some gaps in what I was talking about in the story of Lila thus far, please tell me. I really am here to learn. I mean, what do you make of the story of Lila?
Well, I've got almost like a political question, if you will, which is that, for very legitimate reasons, a lot of people feel like, in Indian culture, there's always kind of a patriarchal element to a lot of things, including the discourses tend to happen a lot of the time between men, whether it's Krishna and Arjuna, or even the context of this scripture is Vashishta and Lord Rama, right? But I think what's really exciting about this actually is that it's a discourse between, it's a discourse between Goddess Saraswati and Lila.
Yes, definitely.
And I haven't read this section, but what I wanted to ask you was if there was any sort of feminine aspect to that kind of conversation, because it seems like what Goddess Saraswati is teaching Lila here is actually a universal truth, right? It's like far beyond any idea of gender or anything like that. But I do think that the way that we deliver these very deep concepts in Dharmic tradition through storytelling and through these, really important personalities plays into it. Krishna's history has a purpose in the moment that he is the charioteer for Arjuna,
right?
Who is this prince, right? So that's why I wanted to see if you had anything to comment on that.
I mean, it's the gender politics of it didn't really immediately come to my mind, actually, which is interesting because in other scriptures, I believe like the tantric gamas and stuff are actually a discourse between Lord Shiva and Ma Parvati, right?
Awesome.
That's
something.
Like
a spousal discourse.
It's a spousal discourse, right? And of course, the gender of Hinduism, the genderization of Hinduism is an important thing because we are really into mother worship, right? When you get into Tantra, it's really about Shakti worship, which is the divine energy and power, right? Which is the extrinsic power, right? As opposed to the sort of latent power, if you will, of Shiva, right? I'm not explaining this exactly perfectly right, but there is a sort of dichotomy there. Although Tantra is in itself a very non-dualistic tradition as well. I like to think of Tantra as the sort of praxis of Advaita in many ways. And actually, when we were talking about debates last time and like all the debates that were happening, women were also participating in those debates. They were mentioning specific figures like Gargi and people like that. And I remember at one point, Adi Shankaracharya is having a debate with some king, and the king's kind of losing the debate. And then his wife is like, we're two parts of the same whole. So now you have to talk to me, bitch, Yeah. And then she's starting to debate him as well and she's talking to him about questions of sex and stuff, which apparently Shankaracharya can't handle because homie's a virgin, and he's a brahmachari and he's just never had it. So he has to kind of resort to his inscape knowledge in order to successfully debate her and things like that. So there is that, but you're right. Like so many of the discourses are happening among men and with men, right?
Well, maybe that's also, I'm also learning in all of this. Maybe those are also the discourses that tend to be the most popular.
Right.
The Bhagavad Gita wasn't always the most popular Dharmic text.
Boom.
Right? So this also could be a result of the Kali Yuga that we live in, right? Which is one where, men listen to men and kind of, but at the same time, one thing I have always had a ton of pride in, and I know the women in my family as well, and my cousins and my friends from the Hindu faith, is that there is a veneration of the feminine.
Definitely.
In Hinduism, and that is not, again, to be comparative, but that is one of the strengths, I think, in terms of, despite everything that goes on in India that is against women.
India, obviously, as a modern state, has a lot of issues with women, dude. We can't deny that, right?
We're terrible with how we treat women.
It's a very dichotomous thing, though, right? Because in India, there is also a veneration of women, and we live in America. America has never had a female president. India's now had a female prime minister. I think we've had a female president as well. Right now, I think the president now is a woman. Is a woman, Draupadi Murmu. Her name is, right?
She was actually just in New Zealand.
Was she? What was she doing there?
I don't know. It's some political shit.
Lord of the Rings fan tour or something.
But it's just we do have this tradition of the veneration of women and the feminine, and associating them with ideas of prosperity, for instance.
For sure.
Mother Lakshmi or knowledge with Saraswati.
Yes.
So it's cool, I think the Hindu in me wants more of that.
Of course, definitely.
Right? And to frame things more in this, the way it's framed here with Lila. I know it's about her wanting to see her spouse again.
Yeah.
So maybe that is one element of it.
Well, all the Bengalis and stuff, they were all Kali worshippers, right? They're really heavy into that. Ramakrishna was devoted to Ma Kali.
Yeah. Durga worship in Bengal is massive.
Massive. That's the game.
Exactly.
That's the whole game there. And so it's we do have it, and it is still very present. Even Aurobindo, right? Aurobindo, if you don't know, he was a philosopher and also a freedom fighter. And I mean, this guy had a gigantic brain. And if I can be perfectly honest and confess to you, I don't love his actual prose itself. So I've always had it's always been difficult for me to penetrate his writings, which are extremely valuable. And it's something that I am definitely missing out on. Maybe we'll try it on Shakti Punch. But Aurobindo himself was all about the mother, right? His consort was I think she was some French woman or something. Do you remember this? Do you know anything about this?
I don't know much about him outside of I want to go to Pondicherry.
But yeah, if you go to Pondicherry and you go to Auroville, which I've been lucky enough to visit and stay at, a beautiful place. The centerpiece of the whole place is something called the Matri Mandir, the Mother Temple. And so women do have a very vaulted position in the theology of Hinduism, right?
Correct. Even last week we spoke about our experience going to see Amma.
Yes.
And so much of her bhajans and everything was actually, she is obviously a mother figure to her most ardent devotees.
Yes.
But also what she was channeling was her devotion to the mother.
For sure.
In all of her bhajans and
for
everything.
Sure.
She wasn't talking about herself.
And look, in many ways, Amritanandamayi is actually a successor to just Anandamayi Ma, who was a previous saint as well, who was around in the 20th century.
That's exactly what I was trying to get at. Yeah, she was venerating her and her bhajans, right?
So it's and the story around her is also really fascinating because she had gotten married and she was always a kind of a space cadet of sorts, right? And she'd gotten married to this guy and it was okay, well, time to get freaky, girl. Let's do the thing that married couples do. And she was not interested in that. And he was oh, and then as they started to talk and the relationship developed, he was oh my God, this woman is divine. And I am her first disciple now. Yeah. And they would go out then on the road and she would be, giving darshan and all that stuff. And so there is a long tradition. India is a very paradoxical place, of course, in many ways. And there's, of course, many waves. The history of India is very vast as well. Right. So our treatment of women as Indians is something that is subject to the vicissitudes of history and things like that. It's shaped by history, right? Our karmas were completely shaped by that. But it's very, very important when you go back to the concept, though, of Lord Shiva himself or itself. If you look at the Shiv Lingam, the Shiv Lingam is the lingam itself, which is a phallic object. But if every Shiv Lingam emerges out of the yoni, which is the vagina, right? And it is showing the inherent non-duality of gender, right? God is non-binary. I'm sorry to break it to you guys. God is they, them.
The story of Lila kind of at first fails the Bechdel test and then kind of Ma Saraswati kind of actually reroutes it, and she's look, this isn't about your spouse. This is about universes, bro. Or I mean, sis. Or whatever. But
So it really succeeds with flying colors in the Bechdel test, ultimately.
Absolutely. Goddess Saraswati really is just like, no, Lila, chill.
Yeah, this ain't about your husband, you know? This ain't about your husband. This ain't about your man. You know, you a body of light, girl. You a body of light waiting to happen. Get on my level. You don't need no man. I mean, the story of Lila is very fascinating, dude. Awesome. It's just, it really, again, when I talk about how Hindu scriptures and Hindu thought is so intensely evolved from just a sort of scientific, broadly scientific perspective, right? Like this is the kinds of questions that quantum physicists and things like that are always dealing with. And it should be a great source of pride for you. You know, there's a lot of amazing, deep inner thought, the ability to go inward and then have the reality of existence revealed to you that way is fascinating. They didn't have a large hadron particle collider or anything like that. Or maybe they did. Who knows? You know? Who knows? If we want to be like Hindu hoteps who were like, we had spaceships. We had nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and this kind of ties back to how we started the podcast, which might be a cool segue for you to take us on before we head out of here, which is that maybe the value of this discussion isn't between Dharma and other Abrahamic religions, but between the quantum physicists and the experts in psychoanalysis, right?
Yeah.
Because that's really what our tradition was exploring thousands of years ago.
It really was. It really was.
And that the West has kind of caught up to in the last
It has.
years.
Well, I mean, if you look at the ancient Greeks, right, and ancient Roman philosophers, like they had a lot, and there was a lot of dialogue between the rishis and the rishis of Greece, you know.
Well, we were having the Pythagorean theorem for Tiffin far before Pythagorean.
For Tiffin, indeed. I mean, they had to know the Pythagorean theorem because in order to do like yajnas and stuff or homas or whatever, the actual setup, the bricks that you have to set up and everything, you had to understand the Pythagorean theorem in some way, shape, or form in order to build these structures. But you know what? I do want to bring it back to this thing being like, listen, this is an ecumenical dialogue of sorts that is within Dharma and outside of what is traditionally called Dharma, right? Psychoanalysts, New Age people, physicists. And yeah, I do want to hear from people who are interested in the mystical traditions of Judaism, Islam, Christianity. I'm of course fascinated by all that stuff. Always Thomas Merton. Who doesn't love Thomas Merton? Who doesn't love Rumi? Right? Rumi is of course an incredible rishi, right? Who he understood what the ism was about. You know what I mean? He was a totally switched on type of character. The dudes who did the Kabbalah or gals who did the Kabbalah and all that stuff in terms of Jewish mysticism. You know, I fucks with it all. I really do. And so, yeah, come on in. We're here to learn. We're here to do this together. This has been Shakti Punch. Thank you guys for tuning in. This has been a really fun thing for me. I hope it was also fun for you. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe our content. Help us keep the podcast going. Hit that subscribe button at the bottom. We will see you again. Thank you so much. Hari Om.